All right, we are going to dive into React hooks and components today, and just learn more about how React works, which means talking about the virtual DOM, the virtual document object model that's a part of React and what it is and what it's doing. The useState hook, which is by far what you will use the most, that lets us give our React components state. We'll learn about the useEffect hook, which is the tool we use to make API calls and let React know that we're doing it. And we'll see some techniques like conditional rendering and using this with forms. And we're going to build out the to-do app that we were looking at yesterday. And then we will have some work time. And then in the second part of our lecture, we'll dive into talking more about components and props and project structure. I know a lot of you dove ahead on this from the material from yesterday. And again, I apologize about the confusion there. The intent was to create that basic React project, but then within the app component, use the techniques that you had been using over the last couple of days with like document create element or document.get element by ID to build the to-do app and interact with stuff. And maybe we just need to message that better or tweak the assignments. So again, I'm sorry for that confusion. The good news is those of you that forged ahead, we're going to see that today. So I'm just going to start off by sharing our curriculum content and talking about it a little bit. The big thing we're going to see today is what React calls hooks. And what these are functions that let us like hook in to the behavior of React. And React components have what's called a life cycle. And as you all are probably starting to notice, React is a little more complex, because if to go ahead and pull up a TL draw, if before the way that like it works to render stuff to the screen, and here is stuff rendered on browser that user sees, right, which is really about the DOM. And the way that this was happening was we had the HTML page, and we had some JavaScript code that we wrote. And in fact, let's put this stuff over here. And maybe we're using JavaScript to modify the document object model, the DOM. And then the browser does the work of rendering the DOM. And this is a really, loose approximation maybe of what like the pipeline looks for how stuff gets changed on the browser. And for some reason, that arrow just did not want to exist and is really tiny. Right? Because an HTML page will have some HTML elements, and those are going to end up in the DOM, and then the browser renders the DOM so that we can see it. When whatever JavaScript code gets sent, this HTML page loads, that goes into the browser, we would write our JS code there, and then that would talk to the DOM if we wanted to modify the DOM, document create element or what have you, and then that would get rendered to the browser. And so in a lot of ways, we were directly controlling, what gets rendered in the browser that the user sees and when. And I just want to check in to see if this kind of makes sense to folks and is in line with like your understanding of, what's happening in the browser and how stuff works. And the big change with React is this. All of the sudden, we are not directly interacting with the DOM, and we actually don't really control when the DOM gets updated now. And let's make maybe like a red rectangle. Right, so that we can see that React.js is different. So, and this is the first time too, like where we've worked with a software application where in a lot of ways we don't directly control like when the code we write gets executed. The React.js UI framework, it does the work of updating the DOM. We're a level removed. We're writing our JavaScript code, our React code that's telling React what we wanted to do, but then it's React's job to figure out how to modify the DOM and make that happen and when that happens. And in fact, React does certain things like batching DOM updates and stuff like that, which means that like stuff isn't always guaranteed to happen in like exactly the right order. But that's also why all these things that we're going to learn today about like useState and useEffect are so valuable and important, because we have to tell React what we're doing and what we want it to do so that it knows when it should update the DOM and what order stuff should run in. So React is sort of like all in. Like we have to do it the React way, and we have to make sure we let React know what's going on. And I just want to pause real quick to see if folks have any questions. And let me make sure I've got our whiskey questions channel pulled up, actually, because if not now, we'll definitely be referring to that shortly. Nika, great question. So React is doing abstraction when it comes to HTML and JavaScript. And yes, I think that's safe to say. Like what happens now with React.js, as you saw like yesterday, yes, there is an HTML page, that index.html from yesterday, but really the only thing it does is load the JavaScript, right, and mount our React application on that one div. So it's not actually generating any of the HTML we care about that like then gets added to the document object model and rendered to the browser. It is now React.js that's creating all of that stuff. React.js is like this layer of abstraction between us and the DOM. Yeah, great question. So one, and that's, we'll see, this is where useState and useEffect come in. And can everyone see my screen? And are we looking at the curriculum repo? And just to confirm, we were seeing the diagram, and is this font size okay and stuff? Awesome. Thank you, Adrian. Perfect. So that's where these hooks come in, because there's this layer of abstraction, we have to tell React when we're doing certain things. And now moving forward, we never want to interact with the DOM directly. It's very, very rare we will do so when we're using React. Yesterday was more sort of about like a learning transitional period, and the full stack week when we were writing the JavaScript code that directly interacts with the DOM was so that you all could learn more about the document object model and how this is working under the hood. Because, you know, if you dig deep enough into React, that's exactly what it's doing. But now we're going to be using React. So if you find yourself interacting directly with the DOM, like document.getElement by ID or something like that, moving forward, that's probably a sign that there's probably, not always, but most of the time, a different and more React-y way to kind of do what you're trying to do. So React is actually a pretty complex user interface framework. It feels very user-friendly, especially because it has this JSX syntax that looks similar to HTML. It's actually quite complicated and really not beginner stuff at all. And the more you dig into it, the more cool computer science related concepts that you find. And a big one is what's called the virtual DOM. And so what React does is it makes a virtual representation of the DOM. So it's got a little JavaScript program running, and it's got a bunch of arrays and JS objects that represent each element in the document object model. And the backstory behind this is that the DOM that's kind of part of the browser is slow. However, having a little JS program that simulates the DOM run is very fast. So when we change something, and we'll see when we change a React component state, or we change a prop, which we'll learn about later today, when we change our application state, React actually runs its little DOM simulator, its virtual DOM, to figure out what has changed. And it figures out the difference, or what's called the diff, between the new version of the DOM and the previous version of the DOM. And the more we get into React, where we see that we have to kind of make sure that, like, when we change an array, we make a new version of the array, or like change an object, we make a new version of the object. It goes back to this stuff. And this idea of, like, it's called not mutating state. Like, if I want to change something, let's not modify it. Let's make a new version of it that has the new value that I want. And then I can look at the difference between those two things and kind of have a nice history. So this virtual DOM simulator is what React uses to figure out what changes it should make based on what we tell it to do in our code. And then it calculates the difference between the new DOM and the current version in its simulator. And then it only makes changes to the real DOM where these changes occur, and the way that React like hooks into the DOM, and it probably adds like IDs to every single element it adds on the DOM. If we were to like dig into that, so that React can like make those changes like more precisely, all of this means that changes to the DOM can happen much faster. And again, think about you're building like Facebook or Google Maps or something like that, right? Where you have a lot of these user interface changes happening a lot. So we sort of have this diagram here, and you can see, you know, maybe our document object model looks like this, and we've got the HTML attribute and body and header, and there's stuff in there, and hello code Platoon, and all these things are happening, right? And React has literally a JavaScript object is what it is, that has all of these same things that simulate this as well. So, you know, if I was to open up the Elements tab and we just take a look at this website, you know, our document object model tree here is we've got the HTML tag here at the root, we've got head, we've got a bunch of stuff in here, all these links. And then, of course, in the body is where it gets interesting. And so somewhere deep in React is, it is almost definitely, you know, a JavaScript object that looks something like this, you know, head, and then maybe it's going to be link, you know, this and something there. And maybe this is how they do it, you know, it's. So I don't know exactly how they do this, but I can pretty much guarantee it's a JavaScript object that represents the virtual DOM. So when one thing changes, React looks at the difference to figure out the change that we should make. So I just kind of, and this is a little more conceptual, but it's going to make a lot of what we're going to be doing very shortly make more sense. So I do want to check in and see what questions folks have. Okay, awesome. So we are going to go ahead and start using state hooks to add some component state, and we're going to start building out some code with a to-do app. And I think the one thing I do want to mention is, well, we'll talk about it as we go and write code, actually. The important thing to know is when something changes, that triggers a re-render of a React component, the React component lifecycle, and that's where these hooks like useState let us hook in to do stuff. So let's start writing some code and seeing what that looks like. So I'm going to put that over here for the time being. And we're going to write some code. So let's go ahead and make a to-do list like we did yesterday. And I'll go ahead and make a directory. And can someone remind me, once I'm inside a directory, what's the command I run to create a new React project with Vite?
npm create vite and then dot.
Yeah, exactly. We're telling Vite, hey, let's create a new React project in the current directory. And this runs npm init and everything. So this is the only command I need to run to spin up a new React project. And as we saw yesterday, we have all of these different directories that are built out for stuff. And can someone remind me this npm run dev command? What does that do?
Starts up our server.
Yeah, exactly. And if I want to like see what the heck is this command dev, what file could I go to in here to learn just a little bit more about it?
Our package.json.
Yeah, exactly. Because we're running an npm script right here named dev, and that runs what's called the Vite dev server. Under the hood, the dev server actually uses this build command as well. And this runs the little web server that we're going to use for our app. So going to go ahead and run npm dev, but I got this error. Failed to load config, error when starting server, cannot find package Vite, and all of these things. Any thoughts as to what went wrong here?
Yeah, you need to install all the dependencies first, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. These are the npm packages that our React app needs, but we haven't installed them yet. Creating the Vite project does not do that. And I can tell that this error message is hard to see, but just remember, you'll always got to run npm install. And if you don't see a node modules directory, then you know that there's nothing installed in there. And by the way, running npm install will never hurt anything. If you run it and stuff is already installed, it'll just skip installing it again. Awesome. So we've got node modules and we've got the package lock JSON that holds all of the specific dependency information. And now I can run my dev server. And I'm going to go ahead and open up the console. So we have it there as we write code and stuff. So, I think I want to start building out the to-do app and start playing with and start talking about state and stuff, but I want to get rid of all of these things. Though this is, great that there's this count button, and actually maybe we'll keep this and look at this. But someone remind me, where can I go to get rid of all of this like boilerplate hello world stuff so we have a clean project to work with?
You can go to your source directory,
Yep.
and then I think it's app.jsx.
Yep, exactly. And in fact, I'm going to get rid of a whole bunch of stuff. And Eric, can you actually remind me, what is this thing here on line 10 and down there at line 31?
You pretty much need it to, I forgot what it's called, but you need it so that it can actually read the HTML or whatever you put in there.
Yeah, exactly. It's called a fragment. And it's because what we return here, it gets turned into HTML to be rendered to the DOM. So everything inside our return statement is stuff that can be rendered, right? This syntax, it's actually like a React element, but it corresponds to the HTML element. And just like the DOM tree, like you need a parent element that everything else is inside. That's true for each component as well. So I could use a div or any other element for that matter if I wanted, but it's very common. And if there's a good reason to, I would. But to avoid like extra divs all over the place, React created this thing called a fragment that solves this for us without creating the extra div. And I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this class name on the div because I don't care about that either. And it looks like we've got an error right now. That looks a little interesting. And that would be because, in fact, I have a div that doesn't have a closing tag. And now we've just got this bit of state. We're not using the logo. We're not using the Vite logo, so I'm going to delete both of those. I'm going to keep app.css in case we want to add CSS, but I am going to get rid of all the styling and I recommend every time you start a new project, you do this, but I see there's still some CSS left here, and can someone remind me where I go to get rid of that?
Index.css.
Yeah, exactly. And which one of these CSS files do I want to be like adding stuff to when I am adding my own CSS? App CSS or index?
That's right.
It got a little garbled in there, but app CSS is the direction that we're going in, which I think is what someone was saying. So I've gotten rid of a bunch of code, but what I've left here is this useState hook, and we have a couple interesting things going on here. So with Python classes, we had instance variables, right? And I could do, that's not what I want. I could do, you know, class car, and we do maybe like def in it, and it would be self, I don't know, make model. And we do, you know, self make self model equals model. And then if I had a method here, like say maybe I would do something like this. And these instance attributes, these instance variables, those were sort of like the data for this instance of my car, right? I could create a bunch of car instances and they would have different values for make and model, and I could refer to that. A component is not really like a class, but there are some similarities. And there's basically two ways that a component, the same way that with a Python class, you add these instance variables to self, and that's sort of like how a class is designed to be able to like hold and store information. The two ways that a React component is designed to hold and store information are what's called props, which we'll learn about later, which are actually arguments you pass in, but we'll get to that later, and state. And the thing about state is kind of like if I create two instances of a car. I don't know. I don't even know what Volvos are out there these days, but we'll do a Tesla, you know, Model S or whatever. Each of these instances has its own values for these. State is unique to each component and each component that we render. We'll see later, like I could create multiple instances of the app component if I want, but we're not there yet. And so this state is internal to the component, and it's what React pays attention to. And useState is a function. Weirdly enough, it returns an array, and we're doing some array destructuring here. And this is the value of this tiny bit of what we call component state. And this is the function we can use to change it. So let me just go ahead and create another bit of component state, and we can see this in action. And let's start making like maybe a really simple form field, for example, for a to-do list that we're going to build. So why don't we call it new to do, set new to do equals use state. Let's make this an empty string. And let's say I wanted to show this, and even before we do this, actually, let's have this be our let's make a display message. Actually, that is getting rid of some unnecessary indentation here. And remember, kind of like with Jinja templates, you know, I can put JS code in between these curly brackets. Right? And it looks like there's a bit of CSS still hiding that I didn't get rid of somewhere. But that's okay. We'll come back to it later. And to be honest, it makes it look nice. Probably what it is, in fact, almost definitely what it is like if you modify main.jsx or things in there, sometimes you need to stop and restart the development server. Though apparently that was not it. So that is a mystery to be solved at a later point. And this first value here is just like a variable now that we've created it, but we don't modify it directly because this is really kind of controlled by React, and React needs to know when this changes because that's the whole point of creating component state. And the way you do it is you do it in little bits like this, using this useState function that React calls a hook to let us hook into the React components lifecycle, in this case to create state. You know, but I can add a console log here, and let's add a console log just to say hello world. And let's just add a console log, and we'll say display message state is display message. And so where I'm going with this is, since it's just a variable, I can put it right in there. And the argument I pass to the useState hook to the function is the initial value I want for this bit of my React components state. And so again, if we go and we look at the HTML elements, we can see all of this happening. And there's actually a couple nifty things here that I want to show while I'm looking at this. If you look at this $0, I believe what that does is like the element that I've clicked on in here, if I now go into the console and I type $0, I get the element that I'm clicked on. So this is actually super useful for debugging as you get deeper into React. And React is doing a little bit of magic here with the DOM and other stuff. And I'm sure there's like method functions you can call on this, but I'm not remembering them off the top of my head. Also, I do highly recommend a Chrome extension called React DevTools, because what it lets you do is look at the state of each component in your React app. And we'll have more components in this component tree later on, right? For the DOM, we have elements. For React DevTools, we have components here. And note that this gets updated live. As I'm clicking this button to change this bit of this component state, the DevTools is changing as well. So this is super useful for debugging. And it's just called React DevTools. If you Google Chrome React Dev Tools, you'll find it. It's a Chrome extension, and you can tell it's the right one because it's got like millions of downloads. So that's the basic idea of state. And then this set function that gets created for each bit of state is how we modify the state and how we tell React that we're modifying it. And the reason I need to do that, and if we go to our console here, by the way, we can see our messages and stuff. Like, you know, yeah, I don't even want to try and modify this directly, especially since it's set as a const and you never really are meant to. But if I want to change my display message, I could do set display message. Goodbye. And here, let's see what my issue is. Let's see, too many re-renders. React limits the number of renders to prevent an infinite loop. The above error occurred at, yeah. So this is a good example of how React is interesting and a little different. And note that I have this massive loop of stuff here. And if let's put maybe this over there and make this just a bit smaller in terms of font size. Let me go ahead and comment this out, and we'll let the hop module reloading do its thing. So the React app loads. The reason we're seeing this twice, for reasons not really worth going into, is React strict mode will have a component render twice when it first mounts to check for certain kinds of issues. You can get rid of this if you want, and it won't really break anything right now if this makes life easier. Later on, you may want to add it back in. I'll actually, I'll check in with Francisco and I'll follow up on that as well, because I'm used to leaving it there. So I'll make sure there aren't any side effects, but this won't do anything terrible, and it does make debugging a little easier. And here, so this is jumping a little bit ahead, but does anyone have any guesses, intuitions, or thoughts as to why when I'm using this set display state function, I end up in an infinite loop, right? Because I'm just seeing these console logs over and over and over and over and over. And then we eventually get this error message that says, you're in an infinite loop, we're stopping you. Brian, yes, sir.
Is it because every time you update that state, it forces a re-render of the app? And so every time the app re-renders, okay, you're saying, let's update the state again, and then a re-render again. And so if you wrap that in an if statement and say, you know, if display message is not goodbye, then set it to goodbye. And that way it'll say, okay, it's already goodbye, so I'm not going to set it again and start it all over.
Yeah, that is exactly it. Whenever any bit of component state changes, it causes a re-render of the component. And remember that a React component is just a function that returns stuff to be rendered to the DOM. So what happens with the re-render? Well, the state stuff, React keeps track of state. It doesn't reinitialize all of this stuff. That's sort of part of the benefit that React gives us. But it runs all of this code, and it runs the return statement again, right? And that's sort of the React component lifecycle with my terrible drawings here. So exactly like you were saying, Brian, because set display message changes state, which causes a re-render. Are we actually resetting? Let me see if I misspoke about how useState is mentioned. We can look at our. No, it's not changing the state. That was my sanity check. We can see here display state message is goodbye. If it was being reset, we would see this as hello. Right? Like the state doesn't get reset, but all this stuff gets run and this gets run. So we change set display message, that causes a re-render. And even though we're not changing the value, React still goes through the process and we're stuck in an infinite loop. So like Brian was saying, if I change this to, let's say, make it so that this doesn't do an infinite loop forever, maybe something like if display message is not goodbye, right? Because now this happens exactly once. And in fact, let's add another console log here. And I'll clear and refresh so we can look at the console logs to see what's happening. We hit our hello world. We hit the display message. We see its state. It gets changed. Let's see here. Hello world display message state is hello. Display message state now is hello. Why is that happening twice? Interesting. I might be because the re-render. Brian, yes, sir. Yeah, I might have goofed as
Because
well.
like React is finicky and the set display message is asynchronous and there's no guarantee when that's going to
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right that's what's going on here, that this gets a little more complex. And in fact, this gets into like maybe using useEffect, which isn't quite where I wanted to go yet. So I didn't quite intend this, but this, Brian, exactly like you're saying, this is a good example. And let me go ahead and clear these annotations. React is finicky, and remember that React controls when the DOM is updated and modified, and sometimes it batches stuff. And so we're not like necessarily guaranteed that all this stuff happens in the same order. I also suspect if I kill and restart the dev server and do a hard refresh, if that has an impact with yeah. I think, Brian, I think you hit the nail on the head. And to be honest, this can be a little confusing. And I think the takeaway here is like modifying state here in this way is not necessarily guaranteed to happen in order and synchronously, because React is sort of driving the bus on when these changes happen. In order to do that, we would use a useEffect, which we will see later. But often what we want to do with state is we wouldn't want to do something like this. We might want to instead have a button to change the display message, right? So let's actually, why don't we code that out? And could someone maybe walk me through what that might look like? So I've got a button, and when I click it, I want this display message to change from, and let's do a refresh here so it should go back to hello, to go from hello to goodbye.
Would you just do a on click equals set display message and then put goodbye inside of the parentheses?
Yeah, I think that gets us awfully close. I think I might just need to use an arrow function so that set display message doesn't get called right away. And let me refresh to make sure that those errors don't go away. So this is looking good. I click on this and it goes to goodbye. Awesome. What if I want this to be a toggle to switch back and forth between hello and goodbye?
Didn't you just do another set of parentheses right next to goodbye? And change it, just do another set and do hello right next to it.
Say that again.
Like another set of parentheses right after goodbye and put in hello. Separated by a comma, so it just swaps back and forth.
You mean like this? Or
No, I was thinking more like how you have goodbye inside a set of parentheses.
Right.
Right after that last parenthesis, just do comma and then another set of parentheses hello.
like that?
Yeah, but hello wrapped in parentheses.
Yeah. This is not, I may be misunderstanding where you're going. I'm not sure that is going to work for us, but it does raise the point that, as soon as this logic starts to get a little more complex, we might not want to have this function be defined inside. And maybe this will help too with what you were saying. And let me note that the state is still goodbye, but when I refresh the page, the React component state is cleared. So this still works. So how can I modify toggle display message? And I'll just go ahead and maybe add that there just so it's there. Just so that it flips between hello and goodbye.
Could you use a useState variable that's a Boolean and then check against that when you call toggle display message, check its value, and if it's false, set display to goodbye and then reset it to true. And then the next time it runs, it sets display message to hello.
Yes, I totally could. I'm not even sure if I necessarily need like an additional bit of state. This is a bit hacky, but as a starting point, like if display message equals hello, let's set it to goodbye. Else, let's set the display message to goodbye. Now there's a bit more to dig into here, or rather to hello. And you're correct, like if we needed like it to be more than just this, we might need more stuff. But this gets me what I want. Right. And as long as like other stuff isn't happening to this bit of display message state, React can handle this just fine because whenever it gets called, it will look at the current value of display message and use this little conditional to flip that. And I just want to check in on questions. So let me take a look at Whiskey questions and see what's on people's minds. And Landon, I see you're saying like when defining state variables and using APIs like Poke API that update these variables, app.jsx gets bloated with functions. We will see that later today and tomorrow how to organize code. But you're correct, like you can write the functions in some other file and import them. without a problem. And it's mostly like writing functions and importing them. There's not like an equivalent to like classes per se. Yeah, good question. What other questions do folks have? What else is on people's minds? Okay, cool. So we have gotten pretty far here. We've done a lot of interesting stuff. Let me go ahead and get rid of this. Let's build out the to-do app using some of the things we've learned, and we'll see how to interact with like form input elements along the way. And then we will take a break and have some exercise work time. And I do want to check in. I think it might have been Landon. You were mentioning, I think, like maybe using like a ternary and a Boolean for this stuff. Do you want to like articulate on that at all? Because I might have misunderstood what you were saying.
That was yams.
Yams, thank you so much. Yeah, Yams, I might have misunderstood what you were saying. If you want to kind of articulate on that at all.
No, you kind of went over if it's just a simple binary condition like this, it's true or false. Then the shortcut here would be to use a ternary for the toggle logic here.
Right, right. And actually, let me go ahead and show what that looks like, because it kind of opens up a couple different options. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that we know for our program, the only display messages we care about are hello and goodbye. And let's say, for the sake of argument, I'll just make a variable named display message. And we'll say that it's actually, let me just go ahead and code this up so we can see what it looks like. What's really common with React component state is to use Booleans for all sorts of little bits of like to track the state of our application. And the idea is that between the React component state and props, that's all the information you need for all the possible different ways that this component could be rendering and that the UI could be in. So I can use a ternary and look at this Boolean and say, if it's true, say hello. If it's false, say goodbye. And I will need to modify this a bit because I made that method go away. So let's do set show hello. And this does get a little interesting because if I'm working with state, like what I want to do is something like this, right? I want to take whatever its current value is and flip it. And these console logs need to go because display message doesn't exist anymore. And I need to put this in a little arrow function. And this is working, right? And I can use a ternary here. However, here, and let's break this out. Let's make this a function and let's call it toggle display message. Let's bring that back, right? But it's much simpler now. The one tricky thing with React component state is if we want to use the current state, like when we're changing it, because something else may be trying to change that same bit of state as well at the same time. Like we saw earlier where I had the if statement and I was like, well, we should be seeing the state just change kind of, imperatively, like one line after the next in order, and it wasn't. We need to be a little careful when we're modifying existing state. And the way we do that is we do this with, we pass a little callback function here. And this can be whatever we want. We can name that variable whatever we want. Like instead of current val, I could just name it current. And this tells React, hey, when you do this state update, grab whatever the existing value is and use that in case there's some other, in case we then have something else also changing that state. And so if you want to use the existing like value of a bit of component state, like when you modify it, that's when you want to use a, you probably want to use a callback like this. I also want to just say that I think this is a nice pattern. The ternary is a nice pattern. Another way to do it that I think is a good pattern to see is, let's just call this render display message. And here I could do and it would help if I spelled that right. So these both do the same thing, but if your logic starts to get more complex, breaking it out into a separate arrow function can make your life easier. So I just want to pause for questions and then let's take a break. And Adrian, I see you saying you're asking, could we utilize useState to adjust the state of completion of our tasks? Exactly. And I think that's what we're going to do right after the break. Natalie, yes.
Sorry, so in line 12, I don't get how the set show hello knows it's referencing show hello when you have your variable name current.
Yeah, totally. That is a little more confusing. Let me actually just pull up the relevant React docs. If you give me just a moment, I should have those. Well, let's go and find them because I think that's going to be the best way to see this. And if we scroll down here, I believe it is this one. So this is actually a good example. So the backstory here is with React batches state updates, we don't directly control when this happens. React does a little bit of optimization. And so, like, even in this bit of code here, when you click on it, we're calling set number to update this bit of state 3 times. Note that it only updates once. Because this isn't happening sequentially, and each of these is working with like an older value. So what we can do, and the way that the set state functions work, is if you pass it a function as an argument, an arrow function, React will pass into the function that you give it. We're giving it a callback, right? The current state value, and use it here. And if I do this, it updates in 3s. This is called an updater function. As I said, this gets a little deeper into React, but I think the main piece here is like, if I want to, when I'm changing state, I want to like change it based on its current value. I probably want to pass in a callback to update it. And then React will know to make sure to pass in whatever the current value is here, and it will queue these to be run. So this is a good read, and it's getting, I think, a little more in the weeds. But to answer your question, React is doing that work for us. If it sees that we're passing in a function, it will look at the current value of the state, and that's what gets passed in as the argument there. So then in our code, and let me go ahead and actually, this whole section is great, but that particular one is good. Let's see if they touch on it in here as well. Yeah, I highly recommend. I'll just share both of these sections. I recommend both of these parts of the reading. But that, and then it is state as a snapshot. Yeah, this is actually quite good. Does that help a bit, at least in explaining like what the behavior is, in why, if we go back to our code, this current is the current value of whatever this bit of state is?
I don't know. I might have to read the website.
Yeah, I think I'm confused too. So like, why are you putting not current at the second part of that?
Yeah, let's break this down. Let's say this is current show hello. So this is the same thing, but, and in fact, let's maybe put this here, and let's const toggle. I'm just going to call it toggle it, because there's too many. I don't want the names to get too long and confusing. So I'm writing a function that is I want to pass in the current value of show hello, and which is a Boolean, and we're gonna flip it. And then what we actually do here is we pass that function in as an argument. And what React does is, when it decides it's time to execute, like set show hello here and change this, it will look at the current value of show hello state and pass that in as an argument here. And then if I condense this, it starts to look like this. Because if it's an arrow function that just has one line, it looks like that. And then this is where I think some of the syntax is in play. And then we end up with this arrow function. And that's what's getting passed in here. Like, if I knew that I wanted to set this to false, then I wouldn't have to do this, right? But if I'm like changing this based on the current value, then I may need to do this. And let me actually follow up with you all later on, because in the more recent versions of React, like when you need to do this changed a bit. And I think this is one of the more complex bits. So let me follow up with a little bit of a better guide of when you need to worry about this or not. Does that help though, at least in like seeing the mechanics of what's happening with this arrow function and what React is doing?
Yeah, that helps a little bit more. I guess I just got confused that you were using like a whole different variable name like current in your function before.
Yeah, I mean, this is just the same way that you can name, like when you create a function, you know, you can name those params whatever you want, and it doesn't affect what the function does if I name this X or hello world. There's nothing special in the name. Let's take 10, and then when we come back, let's build out our to-do list, and then we'll do a bit of workshop time. Let me go ahead and stop the recording. All right, so, and I'm just gonna undo some of this stuff to bring this code back to a good state. So we're gonna build out the to-do app from yesterday, and then we'll break for a workshop time, I think, for all of you to then also build out the to-do app using React component state in your own projects. And then for the last part of the lesson, we'll dig into using props and multiple components and look a little more at project structure. Just to quickly touch on this question of sort of passing in an arrow function when you want to update state. On a practical level, for pretty much all the assignments we are doing right now for today and tomorrow, I don't think there's going to be any issues caused by not worrying about this and sort of React's asynchronous nature with batching state updates, because we don't have enough interactivity going on. So, you know, if I want to change the value of hello, I can write it this way. And indeed here, this variable is, now this is this guy right here, as opposed to a function that we're passing in. And this will work just fine for us. So I would say I will try to follow up with kind of, I think, a better breakdown of arrow functions with the set state functions. But in practice, you don't have to worry about that right now. So let's go ahead and build out our to-do app. And there's a number of things we're going to want to do here, right? We're going to want to get the tasks data from JSON. After that, I want to show the list of tasks, right? And then maybe let's have, you know, an input and form. So a user can create and add a new task. which we then see in the list. And these are kind of the three features, right, of our to-do list at a high level. If we get a bit further, maybe we'll throw one or two more things in, but I think I want to build this out and then break for all of you to build this out yourselves, or if you want to work on one of the next assignments to get some work time with this under your fingers before we dive into components and props. So let's go ahead and work on this together, and I'll get this started. We're gonna need the JSON file with the tasks from yesterday, and I'm gonna go ahead and just make a directory in source named data, and I'm just going to copy it from where it is the other day. If I I'm gonna go ahead and find it. And let's put it, let's just put it in source data. So let me double check that it's there. And indeed it is. And can someone maybe remind me how to import the JSON file here into app.jsx? And maybe just, I'm gonna kind of run down the participants list. George, can you maybe remind me how I want to import my tasks.json file? And you can phone a friend, by the way, if you're not sure.
Isn't it from, you said you're trying to get it from the main.jsx?
Well, I've got tasks.json in this directory data, and I want to import it here into app.jsx.
All right, so we just from, I guess we're gonna do the file path.
Yep.
So
We don't, you're thinking the right thing, but in Python, with JavaScript and ES module imports, we don't need to, well, we do use the from later, but you're right about,
okay.
yeah. And actually, I apologize because there may be a tweak here that I need to make. You know, I apologize. I get confused about this syntax as well. And I think you were right. We probably want something a bit more like that.
Okay.
And I'm going to just go ahead and console log tasks to make sure that we imported it the right way. And it looks like I need to start up my dev server again. So I'm going to make sure I'm in my project root and run that and clear that. And lo and behold, we got that, which is awesome. And George, actually, can you maybe help me? Like, I think we need to put our tasks in some component state here. So how would we go about doing that?
Oh, phone a friend for this one.
Yeah, go for it. Who do you want to phone?
Let's go with DJ.
All right, DJ, help me out. We've imported the tasks JSON and I've got this JavaScript object now, but I want to put it in React component state. How can I go ahead and do that?
So we declared as the constant, open your array.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe we'd use tasks, comma set task.
Yeah. And I think what I'll do is I'll rename this from tasks to, let's
Like
just call
task
this
list or task data. Yeah.
I'm going to call it tasks data. So we don't have a name conflict. And I think I see where you're going with this. useState, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and let's console log tasks and see what we get, and go ahead and refresh. So it looks like my tasks state is undefined right now. how can I fix that so that this state has my JSON data with the tasks?
Did we have to specify JSON in the import? I
You
remember you were
know,
covering something about that.
it that threw an error the other day. It does not seem to be throwing an error today. We were able to verify just a minute ago when we imported this and we console logged the tasks. So I think the question now is, how do I set this bit of state to, right? Because I've got tasks data. I can console log that.
So we would set this use state to tasks data?
Yeah, and remind me what this is doing again. And you can phone a friend.
I believe that sets the tasks variable to the data inside task data, correct?
Yeah, it sets the initial value of our component state. Right, so the first time that this component mounts and renders, this is the value of tasks, whatever we put in use state here. If I put hello world, that would be its initial value. Right, so we don't need that. And if I look in here, I've got my tasks printed out. Right, so we can import JSON and we just give the path to the file and we do import and we just come up with the names. This is just returning one thing. And then what we do when we're using component state is we often want to set an initial value for it, right? And that initial value is what it is starting out. If I refresh the page, that's what it gets reset to.
I remember you did something specific for JSON files. It was an experimental feature that was kicking the warning, and that's what I was trying to
Yeah,
assert. Okay, yeah.
it was something like this. And to be honest, because I'm not getting like an error that's breaking anything, I'm not too worried about that.
Okay, understood.
Yeah, awesome. All right, I think the next step is let's display a list of our tasks here in the return statement, the stuff that this component renders. And I'm kind of, this is a little ad hoc because I know the participants list in Zoom kind of keeps changing, but Nika, you are currently at the top of the participants list. So can you help me get started on displaying all of our tasks? And as always, you can phone a friend.
If we're trying to display them, yeah, I'm just gonna phone somebody.
All right, who do you want
Because
to
I'm
phone?
not sure. Yeah.
All right, Yams, can you help me display some of our display our tasks? We've got this array of objects that I want to display here in this
So-
component.
I think this is probably a good time to try and do the dot map here.
Yeah,
Let's see. So where do we want that display? Just above the button or?
yeah, let's just display it down at the bottom here.
Okay.
I'll maybe comment or get rid of this stuff later. Honestly, I'll just leave it. We'll just have a to-do list that happens to have an extra hello message and an account button and stuff. I'll put H1, we'll just say tasks app. And let's put it right below there.
Let's see. So what do we call it? Tasks. So task.map probably underneath that.
Okay, and I'm guessing you want the curly brackets because this is
Yes, right.
JavaScript.
Yes.
Okay,
Task.map, and then we'll call it singular task. And then equals, yeah. And then we want to, so for each one, we'll make another, would we call it a p tag or would we call it an li?
okay.
And then another curly tag with task.
And task has, each object has an ID, completed property, and then a property named task, that's the description.
Right. would you want to put them like side by side? We would want to do that in like a template literal, maybe, or
Whatever's simple and however you want to do it.
okay. So yeah, let's do that in template literal then. Start that
Okay.
so that we
And
can say like each
And
one
if-
would have. Can we see the data? Exactly what is in it?
and in fact, we
Oh,
don't
that
even
works.
need a template literal, though this is complaining a little bit, and we'll get to that in a moment, because this is all getting rendered, right? So it's only the stuff within the curly brackets that is JavaScript, so I can just have the property I want and the space and, whatever message I want here, like I could do, ID,
Ah, right, okay.
task. And I think maybe I'll just do completed. Let's do task dot completed. And that's everything that's on each task. And they're all done, which is kind of shocking, actually. So I've got this rendering, but I've got this red squiggly, and I'm getting this message missing key prop for each element in iterator. How can I fix that? And as always, you can phone a friend.
Right. We didn't need this, right? This isn't a thing here in React. I think I will pass this off.
All right, who do you want to phone?
So if we're going down a list, whoever's number 3 on the list.
Let's see, that would be Brett. And we may not have encountered this yet. Some of you may have who went ahead, but this wasn't in the material yesterday. So if this is brand new, let me know.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to do either.
Okay, let's break this down. So Yams, this is awesome. First off, because we are doing a list, we're doing an unordered list. So we do want all of our list elements to just be wrapped in that unordered list tag. And I'll end it here just for simplicity. Now there's all sorts of ways you can write this, because this is getting a bit long. I think like sometimes people will do it like this if it tries to help make it easier to read. I don't know if that's better or worse, to be honest. But the point is that we're going through an array and we're using .map, and we're turning each JavaScript object into this React element of this list element with this message. And we're getting this error message key property missing. So whenever we're rendering a list of stuff in React, React needs to know how to grab each individual one, because that's how it like does efficient DOM updates. Here, these H1s, these buttons, these are all different. But when we're like going through a list of stuff like an array, whether it's an li or maybe with a div as well, React needs to know how to find each one. And that's what that warning is. And it's telling us that we need to add this attribute named key. And the key needs to be different for each one. Think of like the index when we're going through a for statement, right? Thankfully, each task ID is unique. So the easiest and quickest way to do this, and this is often what you'll do, is just to use the task ID. So that is one thing to know about kind of iterating and rendering a list of stuff from an array. Right, because just to review tasks.json, it's an array of these objects. So this is something you all are going to be doing all the time. So I do want to check in and see what questions folks have around this, because this is a good one. Okay. Awesome. We are almost home here.
Oh, I'm sorry,
Um,
I had a question.
Oh, yes, sorry, Natalie.
For the key, if your original JSON file didn't already have keys, like or IDs that were unique for each one, how would you go about making a key for it?
Yeah, great question. So the map function, if you like specify a second argument, map, I believe, will like create an index iterator. Let's see if I have this syntax right. Yeah, I think I got that right. Let's double check here. We can look here. Yeah, actually, I will just double check this with a little bit of we can just run a little bit of node and we can do we have an array. If we do r.map and we do, let's just call it item and index. So the .map function, if you pass it, if for your callback arrow function, you give a second argument, .map will give you an index value. And that's usually how you'll do that. Yeah, great question, because you will have to do that sometimes as well. Thank you, Natalie. What other questions do folks have? Brian, yes, sir.
So real quick, on the line 37, after completed, I suspect that the tasks reference should just be tasked so that you get your true false from your completed.
Oh, that was, thank you so much. It's a great example of a silent error. Task dot completed, and let me actually make sure. Yeah, that I'm not sure why. Yeah, that is an interesting point, because I agree here. Let's see what happens if we replace this with ID. So that's right. Yeah, it maybe the Boolean doesn't get evaluated quite right. Well, because I would expect to see a couple falses in here. That's a good catch, because none of this is rendering right now, is it? So this is actually a good example of this function is starting to get a little complicated. Maybe I want to do something like this. And maybe, as to Jordan's point, we do want to use like a template literal here, and maybe we want it to look something like this. ID, task ID. And then let's maybe do task. And then here, maybe let's do completed. And because I've got a template literal here, we can do a ternary and do task.completed. If it's true, yes. If it's false, no. And we don't need that there. And I don't need that there. And then over here, what we can do is this also makes this way more easier to read, though it looks like I might have, there we go. So this is actually not a bad pattern to follow. And that's a great point, Brian. And now we're getting good completed messages. I would have thought React would have just shown like true or false, but that wasn't happening. So this is a really useful technique, and we could put like the LI in there if we want, right? But right now, this really just does one simple job, which is take a task and give us like a message describing it. So it's kind of nice to have that separated out. Yeah, Brian, thank you so much for pointing that out. What other questions do folks have? And I realize that we've gone a pretty long into the work time. I do want to check in with folks. My sense is it might be valuable for us just to continue group coding and add in like the create task form and button, and then move on to looking at components and props. How does that sound to folks? Or would folks like to take maybe 20, like 30 minutes and try and continue this and work on maybe refactoring your to-do app from yesterday to be using React State on your own? I see a couple folks voting for work time. Okay, yeah, let's take 30 minutes and let's work on this to-do app. And what I'll do is I'll push the code up now from this as well. So you could either work on refactoring your to-do app from yesterday to use some of these things with React Component State. Or if you want to build on this code, I'll have that pushed up to the demos and notes repo in just a minute. And let's take 30 and if you're working on this code, work on adding an input field and a form, right? And then a button that you click that then adds something to the tasks. And I think maybe the one thing I want to demo while we're all here is how to update a task, and then let's break and do that. So let me go ahead and just hard code a sample, like an example new task. And I'm just going to make the ID as, what do we have here? The ID is going to be 8. The task is going to be buy groceries. And completed will be false. And let's just make a button that will add it to the tasks. So let's just have a button here. Let's say add example new task. So can someone maybe just walk me through some of the steps that we would need to do here so that when I click on this button, our example task gets added to the list? So what's the first thing I need to do so that this button does anything at all?
And on click.
Yeah. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make a little function and we're going to call it add task handler. And right now, all it's going to do is console log and say add task. And here in this button, let's go ahead and add an on click. And we'll put the add task handler there. And I can see that that works. Okay, awesome. So the next step is now I click the button and it calls my function. How can I update the task list with example new task to add it without worrying about issues around like passing an arrow function in to set tasks or anything like that? I know I'm going to have to use set tasks, right? But what do I want to pass into it?
Is that where you would add your new task?
So I can totally add my new task.
Would you do the spread operator?
Yeah, exactly. I would do the spread operator. Because if I just pass in the new task, let's see what happens here. Well, there's an error because tasks map is not a function because I've actually set this to an object. Right, and then I could then wrap this object in an array. But remember what set tasks does is it just completely it overwrites whatever is existing and sets it to a new value. And so I think it was Natalie, like you were saying, if I use the spread operator for the current tasks, I can create a new array that combines the current tasks and the new one I want. And let's refresh so we get that data and go ahead and click and watch this happen. And lo and behold, we've got task ID 8. So awesome job, folks. Let's plan on taking 30 minutes and I'll push this code up, and whether it's your to-do app from yesterday or this code, work on implementing more of this. And with this code, the next step would be to add a form, right? So that you can put your task in there. And then we'll reconvene in 30 and we'll dig into props and state. So thank you all very much. Definitely take a bit of a break if needed, because I know we've been on the screen for a bit. And I'll be around in Zoom as well. So let me go ahead and pause the recording. So let's pick this up and keep writing code. We've covered a lot of ground. We've been looking at useState, the virtual DOM, a lot of details of useState, useEffect and API calls. I'm going to come back to a bit later. We saw conditional rendering pretty early on, which is cool, right? Where we can use a bit of a tiny bit of component state as a Boolean. I'm going to build out the to-do app so we can kind of see this in action. As we do this, we'll get to components and props and start to see how these things relate. So as a reminder, we've got this array of objects. That's our task data. And we've imported it. And we have this other set state stuff from when we were playing around before. And we have our counter, which I think we all kind of have a much, like we're growing our understanding of what's going on here with component state. It would help if I had my dev server running. That's why this get localhost connection refused error keeps popping up. So let me go ahead and do that. And let me just do a refresh just for sanity. And we've been playing with different patterns of doing things, right? We saw how to write a one-line arrow function to toggle a Boolean value and use a set state function to update that. We saw how to write a one-line arrow function with a ternary to change what message we display here. We saw how to write a helper arrow function with the rendering of tasks. And we got to creating an example new task and a function to add a new task by destructuring the existing array of tasks, adding the new one to it, and making a new array, right? This takes this tasks array and it breaks it up and adds this on all in one new array. And the important piece here is making sure that we're adding our new task object to the array. And because React needs to look at, like, React doesn't know so much what's inside the array. It is asking, has this array variable itself, like it looks at where it is in memory and sees if that has changed. And that's why we need to create a brand new array here so that there's a new instance of array in memory where rather than modifying that array, we're creating a new version with the updated data. And we're going to see that pattern over and over in React. And we'll come back to this task button, but really the next task with our tasks app is it'd be nice if there was an input field where we could, type the new task that we want to create. So let's go ahead and add it down here. And we'll add, just for clarity, a header, create new task. And we're going to need an input field, right? And maybe we want a placeholder, and that placeholder will say enter task description. And that's it. And I've got an input, right? So this is where it gets interesting with React. And the thing to remember is React's job is to talk to the DOM. So our job is to get data into React's component state. I want to get whatever I'm typing into this input into component state. So a really common pattern is you might make a little bit of state for every field that you have. So let's go ahead and do that now. And we'll name this new task input and set new task input because it's an input field. So that sort of tells me what's going on here. And we'll set the default value to be an empty string. Now, this isn't all that interesting right now. I still need to get the data from here into the component state. And I need to display it. And this is the pattern is called a controlled component because we'll see this with components later. I'm just going to write a simple function and let's name it candle new task input. And we'll see what this does later when we use it. So over here for the input, I'm going to take advantage of the onChange attribute that we get, where I can pass it a function that will be called every time I type into this input field. And we're going to call our handler new task input function there. And like all, input fields and everything with the DOM, it's the world of events. So there is going to be an event that's passed in here. And let's just console log that and let's look at event target value. And I like adding little messages so I know what's what when I look at my console logs. So let's put that there. And that's all I'm going to do. And I'm just going to make sure that that works. And that looks pretty good. Now we just have to do set new task input event target value. Right? And that has been updated. And in fact, if I go into React DevTools and I look at the app and I scroll down here to look at the state, and let me make this a bit bigger. And we look at new task input as I type. Let's clear this. It takes a minute, but I can see it happening in real time. So this is a nice confirmation that I've hooked up this input to my component state correctly. Now, the last bit that is a little interesting is even though we're seeing this here, this is actually not totally connected to React. We want to close the loop. I actually want the value of this input field to come from my component state. And the input element has an attribute named value, and we can set it to, what did we call this? New task input. And if I refresh this, this should be empty because it's an empty string. And as I type, I see this here because this gets updated every time I type, and we're going through that React component lifecycle. And so if I wanted to, for example, up here, when I create this state, I could, default task description. We probably wouldn't want to do this for a task, but this can be useful for other things, right? So now, all of a sudden, I've got access to whatever I type, and now things get interesting because I've got this add example new task button. I've got it all hooked up to the add task handler already. So maybe let's take example new task. The issue of the ID, making sure the ID is up to date is a little funky, but one more or less correct approach that's fast and lazy is we could do tasks, our component state dot length. And we probably need to do +2 because we're not zero indexing. +1 so that we don't start at 0, and +2 to move one ahead. And this is, of course, not an example task anymore. This is a new task. And the description of the task is our other bit of state, new task input, and completed is false. So fingers crossed, I didn't get something wrong along the way, but let's see how we do. And let me refresh the page to make sure I don't have any warnings or errors. I had some Chrome extension complaining about something. And note every time I type, the component is re-rendering because every time I change state, which is happening for this new task input state, all this code is running, right? We're not resetting state. React keeps track of the state values, but all this runs and the whole app component re-renders. Which is okay. React is meant to do that, and it can do that very efficiently. So here is the moment of truth. This looks great, except it looks like my +2 didn't have it right, and I probably want that to be a +1, so the IDs are right. But otherwise, we're good. And if I look in my task list here, I've got buy more groceries. So we have just closed the loop, and we've seen how to add a task. And I just want to pause and check in and see what questions folks have. And let me catch up on the questions channel. The +2, Nika, I thought since the ID starts at 1 and you index arrays starting at 0, I thought we needed that, but I got confused because it's the array length, so we don't need the extra 2, it's just +1. On change, so on change, just like there's the on click attribute, and this fires off an event when this button gets clicked. Every time this input field is changed, every time I type a letter in here, it calls this function and passes an event to it that has the new value of the input field. And that's the on change attribute. Some other fields have it as well, but the most classic use of it is here with the input element. Okay, awesome. What about deleting a task? So a couple things need to happen if I want to delete a task, right? I have to go through the array. I have to find what I want to get rid of, and I have to know what I want to get rid of. And Jasmine gave us a great example of that this morning where she was using filter. Let's assume that we're passing in the task object here. And we're going to return our tasks array, our bit of component state, and we're going to filter it. And what we're going to do is, I'll write this out in full. If task ID equals task to delete dot ID, return false. Right? Because we found the task we don't want. Returning false is how we tell the filter method to get rid of it. Otherwise, return true. And we keep everything else. And filter creates a new array. So fingers crossed, this will work. Let's try it out and see. Though this starts to get a little more complicated because I kind of want my button to be here, right? And then on click is delete task handler, but I need to pass it the task, and that needs to go inside an arrow function. So this is actually a lot of stuff to cram into one line. So before I use this, let's update our render task method. And I apologize that this jumped around here. And actually, let me go ahead and grab this and put it right below the return statement. Since it's about rendering, it kind of makes sense to put it there. And let's have our list item. And there's a bunch of ways to do this because, in fact, I think what I'll do is this. This is the nice way to refactor it. We'll make a string that's our task description. And what we'll return is a list item that has the task description in there. And remember, we need a key, so we might as well pass that as well and just set key equal to key here. And it would help if I added a closing curly bracket here. And now when I'm ready, I can add my delete button for an individual task really nicely. Let's test and make sure that this render function is working. So it looks like I am maybe missing a closing parentheses, which is always tricky with this stuff. And I still see my tasks, so I think I'm good. So now let's add our button. We'll call it delete. It's messy, but it works. And on click, we will do an arrow function that will call, what did we call it? I'm not being very consistent in my names. I should really name this handle delete task, but delete task handler, and we will pass it the task. And this way, when we call this function, it has the information for our specific task that we want to delete. And let's see if this works. So it does not seem to be working at the moment. So I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add a console log. So we can see what's going on. And let's add the console log here too. And we'll just add one here. Just add a ton of console logs to see what's going on. And I'll refresh the page and see if this works. And then I think this is a good time to check in and see what's on people's minds. So my deletion, so that actually was working. I actually forgot the simplest step here. I think my logic is right. Can anyone maybe tell me what's the piece I forgot with my delete task function to actually make this delete the task? Saul, yes, sir.
And I'm not sure if I'm right or wrong, but I just don't see it. You're getting the your tasks, removing it, and then returning the new tasks.
So you're on the right path. George, yes, sir.
Never mind. I thought I saw something.
Brian, yes, sir.
Sir, is there some kind of state that needs to get updated after you have that task.filter?
Yeah, I totally forgot, right? This task state, this is the source of our list. So to delete something, I need to remove it from this tasks array in our component state. And I use set tasks to do that. Now these print statements, because I only see one task to delete and a whole bunch to keep here, that tells me I probably wrote this right. And I wrote this very verbosely on purpose. I hope it helps with readability. If it backfired, I apologize. You can probably write this in about 1 or 2 lines. What I forgot is I need to update the React component state. This correctly constructs the new list of tasks, I think, with what I want to delete. And then Brian, like you were saying, and I think you guys were on this path as well, we need to do set tasks, updated tasks. And if we had a more complex application, this might be where we wanted to use an arrow function, but since really nothing else is going to be messing with the task lists, this is fine. Let's see if this does the job. And there we go. And now I believe I can delete things and they go away. And just to make sure, I'm going to kind of make sure that I'm not accidentally deleting more than one thing. And it sure seems like the thing I want to get rid of is being deleted. So this is probably a good point to check in and see what questions folks have, because I covered a lot of ground here. So I'm curious what's on people's minds. Adrian, yes, sir.
On the onClick, for the return statement and the tank description, are you able to explain the arrow function that's going on in there?
Oh, right here?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So remember, on click, on change, any of these things that are called when stuff happens on the DOM, what the browser does is whatever this function is, it calls it and passes in an event as an argument. We actually don't care about the event here. I could like I could write it this way, and I apologize. I really need to rename delete task handler. I don't know if this helps with readability with this or not. But remember, like, if I just did this right off the bat, what would happen is as soon as this was rendered in the browser, this function would get called, right? Because that's what I'm doing with these parentheses. So I wrap it in an arrow function that says, hey, here's the function definition. And then when this happens, onClick calls the arrow function, which calls that. Does that help break that down a bit, Adrian?
Yeah, I actually, what would be the difference between just having the delete task handler with the task thrown in there? What's the difference between that and calling it with the arrow function?
Yeah, the difference is this happens right away. Like when the component renders. Because we're calling the function. So like as the browser is reading this, or as React.js is running this, it says, oh, there's a function. Oh, we're calling it. Let me execute it. But that's not what I want to have happen, right? This is defining an anonymous function, an arrow function, right? And then we pass the function definition as an argument. And then when it's clicked on, it's called.
All right, that makes a lot more sense. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. And I see a question in Whiskey Questions. For the add task handler function, we don't need previous values like we talked about before the break. That is a great question for like adding a task and updating a task. If ideally, yes, you would do that with the arrow function, but on a practical level, it only matters if a bunch of things might be changing that React state, like possibly at the same time, because that's when issues can arise. On a practical level, because it's just the one, like nothing else is changing this but us, it doesn't matter right now. So where I want to kind of go next is looking at this render task method that we wrote. Because if you look at this, it starts to look an awful lot like a component. I have a return state, I have some JavaScript logic stuff, and I have a return statement that returns stuff to be rendered. So in fact, maybe what I want to do is in my source directory, let's make a new component. And I'm going to have to, actually don't have to import React. So you always name the file the same as you want your component. Name the function with a capital letter when it's a React component. That's like the one time you kind of break the rule. What you will do is you will export, and you will export default task like this. You could also do it here on one line if you wanted, but it's actually a bit readable and better to do it this way. And the default means that when I import this, I don't have to worry about curly brackets or anything like that that we saw the other day. In fact, I could name this whatever I want, but it's most of the time you're going to want to name it the same thing as the component. And let me full screen this for a moment and split the screen so we can take a look at this. Because what we're going to do is we are going to take this render task stuff. And we are going to drop it, not there, but right in here. So a couple things. I don't need that. I don't need that. I don't need the beginning of the arrow function. I don't need the end. I do need my arguments. And the way that components work is every component takes one argument that's an object. And by convention, you want to name it props, which is short for properties, which is the arguments that will pass into the component. And we'll see what this looks like in a second. And note that my component has a return statement where I'm returning stuff. And what I'm going to do to make life a little easier is we're gonna do task props dot task, and I'm just gonna assume that the props object will have the task on it. And we're gonna do const key equals props dot key. And I'm just gonna assume that the props object will also have the key on it as well. And all of these squigglies are more about these ones are about props validation stuff, which is a little outside scope. This one is relevant because we need this function delete task handler. Well, we can pass functions as arguments too. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And so now over here, where we're doing tasks.map and all this stuff, instead of render task, which doesn't exist anymore, let's use this task prop or this task component. And just the same way in main.jsx, where this is how like we render a component that we've created, we're going to render this task component. However, we have to do a little bit more stuff here in order to pass in the props or the arguments that this component takes. And remember that this is still a function at the end of the day, just like any function that takes arguments. Since this is an object, we are going to destructure it. And I feel like I have a misspelling lurking somewhere. And it would be right there, wouldn't it? Yeah, and the props validation stuff, we're not going to worry about right now, and that's not an actual error. And the way that you pass arguments to a component when you're rendering it looks very similar to HTML, but these are called props. And this is a little unwieldy to have on one line. And what you will often see is something that looks something like this, which is a little weird to see at first, but then you get used to it. And I don't need this UL anymore. But I do need to close my curly bracket. So let's put that there. And again, it's a bit weird when you see this for the first time, but you end up getting used to it the more you do it. And let's see, do I have an extra curly bracket somewhere? And I want the key to be the index. And oh, I do need my closing. So I have some sort of syntax error somewhere, and when we look at it in the browser, we'll see where it is. And let's see if we can't sort that out real quick. So as always, the easiest way to debug is to get rid of stuff. So I'm just going to kind of put that there. And it's because I forgot a closing parentheses for the map, which I can now see. So let's put that back. And let's put the closing parentheses for the map. And that red squiggly goes away. And let's see if this renders or if we get an error. And this does render. And let's see if it deletes. And it does delete. So multiple components and props. The thing to know about a prop is whenever it changes, this function also re-renders. And if I went ahead and like created component state in here for some reason, it only lives inside this component. So creating different components is how you can organize stuff like this. And having a parent component like app here that holds our application state and passes it down into a child component as props and passes functions with logic to update this stuff as props. And having, this is sometimes called a dumb component, because if you look at this doesn't hold any state. It's entirely determined really by the props that are passed into it. And that's a common pattern. So I want to check in and see what questions folks have and what is on people's minds with props. Nika, yes.
My question isn't about props. It didn't get answered before. It was about why you decided to use on change with the input field.
Oh.
Instead of like just doing it another way. And is that just, that's just how we should be doing it, period.
Oh, absolutely. I apologize. I missed that. Great question. The reason to use on change, and do you mean connecting on change to component state?
Yes, specifically with the input. Yeah.
Yeah. So, because with React, we want React to really do all the work of modifying the DOM. And because like there are two ways that React knows basically to re-render a component: when props change or when the component state changes. So by using on change here and connecting it to some component state, it allows React to control this input, which it makes it a little cleaner, and the more we do with it, the easier it becomes. Like for like among other things, every time the user types, on change is triggered, which updates the component state. And so our React application always has a good picture of everything in the app, right? It always has whatever the user's typed in here in component state. And then anytime the user clicks to add a task, we know that that's going to be good. Does that help break that down a bit?
Yeah, I think that helps. So you're just saying basically it's always better for it's okay that React is constantly like taking pictures of every single letter we're putting in there. It would be better for that to happen instead of us trying to do it another way, basically.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
It feels a little weird. It ends up working better. It actually ends up being less to think about because it just does it all the time, and React does little updates like this very efficiently. And also because now my app component, like if I wanted to, like if I open up React DevTools and I look at the app, and we'll let it load up the state, and we'll find the one that's holding the form data, which is new task input. So this is an example with React DevTools of modifying a component state, but there could be other situations where we want some of our other code to modify that state and modify what's in there, right? Like, for instance, maybe like with this task component, we want a checkbox or something like that. Or maybe we want to like strike through this stuff. So it just becomes more and more useful to have as much hooked up to React as we can.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. What other questions do folks have? In particular, if there are questions around components and props, because I know that we just threw this one into the mix.
I've got a, oh, sorry, Natalie, you can go.
Oh, you can go ahead. Go first.
In an instance where you're changing like something that I've been doing is working on just doing the whole, you click on an item and it crosses it off. And I have a function that changes the completed, like whether it's completed or not.
Mm-hmm.
But nowhere in there is it forcing a re-render. Is there a way to force it to re-render the component? Because right now I can click on something, but it's not going to actually cross it off until I A, hit the submit button, or B, start typing my new task, and then it'll force the re-render on the component and then update with the strike through.
Yeah, great question. And that raises a really good point. Whenever a component's props change, it causes a re-render. So on the one hand, the fact that this task prop is an object makes our life a little simpler because there's less props. But React can't tell if a property on this object changed, if task.completed becomes true or false. But all of a sudden, if instead we do this, and maybe I want to call this description instead of task.task. Right, and what React does is each of these becomes a property on the props object. So remember, this is an object named props, and it will have each of these as a key value pair on it. And the convention in React is to just destructure it right here, is almost always how you see this. And now I do have to do a little modifying here to get these names right. So that becomes description. This just becomes ID, right? So, and the nice thing here is actually this does make this other code easier to read, right? The only downside here is all of a sudden delete task handler, well, it was taking a whole object before. So what do we do now? Well, I could pass the whole object, but in fact, maybe we just want to pass the ID because that's actually all we need. And so maybe over here in delete task handler, we're just going to do, let's just change this to task to delete ID. And we can put that right there. And then this just becomes like that. And that actually kind of simplifies this function in some ways too, right? So first off, let me make sure that I haven't broken anything in my code. And now to get to your question, once we change the value of this completed prop, it will force this to re-render. So what we can do is let's look at app.css. Does anyone remember, like, how do I do strike through text?
Line through? Isn't it text decoration
It's,
line
yeah, it's
through?
text decoration, line
Thank you
through,
so
and there's a
much.
hyphen. Yep.
Completed. And let's make this just gonna keep the name really simple. And let's call this incomplete task. And we're not going to put anything there. Well, let's just maybe, just for fun, let's make the color blue, just so we know that this is working. And now let's do something like this. And this is getting a little harder to read that way. So maybe I want to just reformat a bit how I'm organizing this. So I recognize there's sort of, everyone has their own preference of how to write React stuff to be easy to read. So your mileage may vary, but let's do const, let's just call this task CSS, and we will do if completed is true. incompleted task. Actually, if it's true, it should be completed task, shouldn't it? And if it's false, we'll make it incomplete task. And then over here, we can do class name task CSS. Now, I don't think we actually added the complete task logic. But we can actually see that this is working. Right, and this combines, there's each of these little pieces is relatively straightforward once you see this. This is just a ternary. But because we're using React, which is like a template language on steroids, we can use JavaScript for the logic of which CSS class to use. And I do recommend make the CSS classes for like a complete state of something. It's simpler to just change the name of the CSS class than like logic for the details. And in fact, we can go ahead and write a complete task function as well, and that might be fun to see. And let's do that. Let's call this handle complete task, and let's have it take a task ID. And what we're going to want to do is we need to update our tasks array in the React component state for app. And we're not getting rid of a task, but we are modifying it. So map might actually be an appropriate fit here. And what we can do is we will have to return a new object so that we're building something fresh. And then what we can do here is we can change completed to true if we find the right ID. So we could maybe do something like and in fact, I think that will work okay. Just to be safe, I think maybe what I'll do is something like this. And this actually makes it, I think, a bit easier to read. Task becomes task.task. And then completed becomes, let's do a ternary where we can do a little comparison and we can say if task ID is the same as task ID, and I'll put this in parentheses if it makes it easier to see this. And to be honest, this one might be a bit better as an if statement because this is a bit complex for a ternary. But we're basically saying if we find a match, set completed to true. Otherwise, actually, we don't want it to be false. Let's just leave it as whatever it currently is. And then completed is our new completed. There's undoubtedly a more elegant way to do this, but this does get the job done. And remember, we've written this in our parent component in the app, which is the smart component that holds all the logic. And now we're going to pass this as a prop. And we're going to call it handle complete task, and we're going to pass it in there. And in fact, we can use this same pattern that we have with the button. And I do need to update over here because we've added a new prop. And after this, I realized we ran a bit long, so we should probably break. And we can call this complete, right? And so now when I click on that, it should take the task ID. So I do actually need to make sure that I'm passing that in because I don't believe I'm doing that here. And if we look at delete task, I think I might need to make sure that the task ID, oh, I did a little wrapper here. So, right, if we want to, what we could just do is something like this. This is honestly the easiest way to do it. So you can kind of see both patterns in action here. And let's see if that broke anything and if it works. So I am getting this warning, key is not a prop. And it looks like maybe I didn't pass that in correctly for my task. But I do have I right here. So I think I'll cross that one later. That I think was an implementation error along the way. I think the interesting thing is if I hit complete here, I didn't quite get this working. We didn't quite take it home because something, it doesn't seem to be, it might not be updating correctly. So let's take a real quick look at React Component DevTools and see if we can get it working. And if we can't, we might have to circle back to this one. And in fact, I think what I'll do is we can just add a little console logging and see if it fixes this or not. And let's console log the task ID. Let's console log task. Let's console log new completed. Oh, and I think I made the same mistake here as before with my other very similar function of once I build my updated list of tasks, what do I have to do with it so my React app actually updates?
You gotta set state.
Yeah, I have to use set tasks to actually update the list of tasks. And that actually does it for us. We didn't implement a toggle behavior. But so the reason this works is, and in fact, we can take a look, and if we look first off at our React component tree, note that the app component has all these child components of different tasks. And each one has separate props, and each one has this callback function. And so what happens is when we click on handle task complete, that calls a function that updates the state here tasks, right, in the app. And because of that, we get a re-render of the app component. And then because this re-renders, it runs all this code again, including this return statement, including with the new updated state for our array of tasks, building all the task components and passing these in as props. And then because this prop completed has changed, when this, well, for all the task components, but particularly for the one that has changed, this re-renders. And then this logic gets called and it gets flipped and we see the strike through happen. So this is a big concept in React too. You change state in the parent component, pass it down in props to your child component, and that causes the child components to re-render. And we went long, so thank you very much. And I think what we'll do is let me take questions and I apologize to cut into our afternoon coding time, but there is absolutely one more thing we need to cover. So let's plan on reconvening for 30 minutes after lunch. So let's actually break here. And the last bit that we'll cover, we got a lot through talking about components, creating components, exporting, parent and child relationships, prop, destructuring, right? Taking this props object and breaking it into all of its component things. And the important thing to remember here is when we are rendering a component, each of these is a prop. And React bundles it up into an object and passes it as an argument, and then we can break that object up. And this is the pattern that you'll see all the time. What I want to cover after lunch is we did not look at useEffect, which is how we can make API calls and do stuff called side effects, where something changes, we get new data, but it's not from a prop or state, right? Like if we make an API call to the Pokemon API, we need to somehow tell React that that's happening so it can control maybe re-rendering the component, and maybe we change some state and props and stuff. And so I think just for maybe 20 to 30 minutes after lunch, we'll look at useEffect and how to do that. How does that sound to folks? Cool. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm happy to stick around a bit more for questions for those who have them, but I know we ran long, so I really appreciate it. Have a great lunch. I'll send the agenda out, but we'll return at 1:30 Central. Briefly, we should be able to cover this in 30 minutes or less, and then we'll do some pairing for the afternoon, which I think will be useful in writing code and working through this stuff together. So thank you all very much. So the last thing we have to cover is another hook in React, the same way that useState is a hook, called useEffect. And we import it from the React package the same way we do as useState. And these are what's called named imports within the curly brackets, which is different from the default export that we saw when we created our task component in a separate file and exported it. And I've gone ahead and I've created a new React project just with the hello world here. And we're going to learn a bit about useEffect and use it to get some data from the Pokemon API into our React app and display it. And then kind of depending on people's levels of interest and time, maybe we'll add a couple more features. But that's really, or review a bit of the other things we covered today, but that's really the main focus. So a React component, and let's go to our friend TL Draw here for a moment. I think we'll just go off to the side here and we'll maybe use a giant sort of hexagon type shape. And we'll call this component app, because that's the component that we've been using the most. And we made some tasks, right? And we had like a task component, and we had another task component, and we had a couple of task components. So let's make a couple tasks, and we'll kind of just lay them out vertically, just to sort of review a little bit about the React component lifecycle. And then we'll see how that ties into useEffects. right? And let's just pretend there's only like 3 tasks in our tasks array. And we saw how we can iterate through that map, and this parent component app passes down props into each of these tasks. Right? And in fact, what we end up having is it is often the state of the parent component that gets passed down as a prop. And we saw that with tasks and an individual task, and we saw that we can even pass functions down as props. And we know that, and let's draw this in blue. For any React component, a state change causes a re-render. And we know that for any React component, a props change causes a re-render as well. And what we saw is if I change the state of my parent component and I'm passing that down as a prop, when this state changes, the prop changes and it causes this to re-render, and it's like this whole cascading chain. So the question now becomes, what if I want to make an API call? Or what if for some reason I need to work with some sort of mapping library that has interactive stuff, or I need to work directly with the DOM? Like maybe there's the rare edge case where I need to directly interact with the DOM or a graphics library or something like that. Something that's gonna change stuff, right? Because like our API call is gonna send back data, and we're gonna want to do something with that data, and we're gonna maybe want to even, change the React component state. But how is React and how is our React component going to know when this happens? And how is it going to know when it should happen? Like, should it happen before we render our tasks? What if we have to make an API call to a database to get that task's information? How do I tell the React component to wait? Especially since we don't directly control when React updates state or re-renders and stuff like that. And we saw with JavaScript, we have promises and we have async, await, and we're going to use those, but we need this other tool to control what are called these side effects in React. Because really anything that's not about a prop or a state, React kind of thinks of as a side effect. And that is where this this hook name, useEffect, comes from. How do we deal with side effects? We're going to pass it a callback function. You are usually going to use it to fetch data from an API. That is by far the most often when it is used. So let me just go ahead and write a little code and put it into action, where we can hit the Pokemon API and then we can talk about it. And let me go ahead and bring you into the fold. So, you know, let's say we know once we get our Pokemon data, we're going to want to put it in React component state. And let's just have it be an empty array. So I think the Pokemon API sends back an array of JSON. And we know we're going to have to fill this up. And this is how you use the useEffect hook. And like this prompt says, it accepts a function that does something that React calls a side effect, right? That's not about change, that something is, we're getting new data to the system from something that's not state or prompt. And we'll see that we have a little bit more control over when this happens. So you will usually pass an arrow function in as the argument to a useEffect hook. And it will look like this. And the useEffect hook will fire every time the component renders. And if we go to the console log and we refresh, we see we've got useEffect. This is not React related. This is some Chrome extension, something or other. Right, and it's firing and it's doing something. And what we'll often want to do is, once we get our data, we might want to update the Pokemon API. So let's pretend we make our HTTP request. Get data, and const. Say we get something like this, right? And we get Pikachu, and we get Charmander. And as we learned this morning, we can then set Pokemon to our Pokedata. However, if you will all note over here, something very interesting is happening. I'm stuck in an endless loop with this useEffect, kind of like we saw earlier today with setState. useEffect fires every time the component renders. When I change component's state, it causes a re-render, which causes the useEffect to fire again, which changes the component state again. And I'm going to kill it because it's I think the endless loops is slowing my machine down of all things. Interestingly, my Mac seems to be choking a little bit, which is kind of surprising because usually it's not really an issue. There we go. So we were stuck in this endless loop, and we'll bring it back in a moment because the component renders, it calls useEffect. We change our component state, which causes the component to re-render, which causes the useEffect to fire again, which causes it to change the state again, and on and on and on and on. So what you almost always need to do when you use the useEffect hook is pass it a second argument after the function that has the callback function with the stuff you want it to do. And this is called the dependency list, and it's an array. And as the description here says, if present, the effect will only activate if the values in the list change. The good news is a common technique is just to pass an empty array, because what this does is it fires when the component renders, but it won't fire again after we do the set state. And let's actually watch this in action. So now I don't have my loop. So the useEffect does always fire once when the component first mounts. But with the dependency list, with this array, we can control if it fires again. What's not uncommon is something like maybe we have like selected Pokemon name. And maybe, and if we have time, I'll build this out. But maybe we have a little drop down of our Pokemon and we want details and we want to make like a second API call or something like that. And so maybe then we listen for that there. But adding this empty array, this dependency list to useEffect is something you'll want to do pretty much all the time, either an empty array or something in it. Otherwise, you're stuck in an endless loop. What React also does with useEffect is React guarantees the order that these happen in based on where we have them in our code. So I can, even if I'm making an API call to one API here and another API call to something else here, React will guarantee that this one fires first and finishes whatever it's doing, and then this one fires. So that is very useful. And I wouldn't actually want to. So let's go ahead and actually code this up to get the Pokemon data. And before doing that, I just want to check in to see if folks have any questions. David, yes, sir.
Yeah, so I'm not fully understanding the purpose of the empty array after, or it's within the useEffect, right? But, or no, it's after the useEffect function, after the arrow function. Like I understand that it stops the infinite loop. And I understand like why we need to have it there, but like the why under the hood or like how it actually works. And you may have explained that, I might just not be understanding.
The under the hood part, I think, is not worth going into, and I'm honestly not sure exactly how React implements it under the hood. But I think the important part, as you touched on, is the behavior that when a function first like mounts or renders, the useEffect will always run. But then it looks for this array, this dependency list, to see when it should fire again. And if it's not there, it will just fire every time there's any re-render, which can cause an endless loop. And we'll see a bit later how this becomes useful. But think about, say, like again, imagine you have like a list of Pokemon and you want to click on one to get like a bunch of details about that Pokemon, and you need to make a second API request to do that. We can kind of hook this up to a little bit of state, and when that changes, make a new API call. So I think the behavior is the most important piece, and that to stop the infinite loop, you almost always want this empty array here. And I think as we build it out, hopefully it will help address that a bit more as well. And so what I do want to do is I want to go ahead and let's actually get some Pokemon data and make an HTTP request and do some async await stuff. So we're not gonna do the fake stuff. We're gonna do the realist stuff now. And I'm just gonna write sort of a helper arrow function in here, get Pokemon. And it's gonna be an async function. And so inside there, we will use await. And I do want to use Axios. So I actually do have to install Axios. So let's do that real quick. And you know, whenever, I mean, I had to kill the dev server to install Axios, but if for some reason I was in a different terminal or something, like once you install an npm package, and also when you add import statements, those are times when you might need to restart the dev server and the hot module reloading might not pick it up all the time. So I've got Axios imported, and let's make a GET request to the Pokemon API. And I have sort of the API endpoint that I want to use here written out, that we're all becoming much more familiar with. And I believe we're just going to get a bunch of Pokemon types. And maybe we're just going to get 10 of them. Let's console log the response data. Make sure we're getting what we want. And now let's actually call this. And let me go ahead and comment this stuff out.
With an extra V2.
Oh, thank you so much. And this looks about right. If I look in here, I've got a massive list of Pokemon. So I got the Pokemon. The last thing I need to do, and this needs to happen inside the async function, right? Because this needs to happen once we get this data from the Pokemon API, is I'm going to set my React component state. And this is the cool part, because this is where we like hook up this sort of async await behavior to React component state. Right? And this is how the pieces sort of come together. And so now whenever my app loads, this Pokemon bit of state should be filled up. And let's do a little mapping here to see if we're seeing what we expect with the Pokemon. And we can use what we learned, and it would be something like this: Pokemon map. And let's do, I'm just going to do Poke and I for index. And I'm going to map it to a list element that will give the key attribute so that React knows how to find each individual item in this list of stuff. And we'll do Poke, it looks like name, just to get the ball rolling. So the good news here is I clearly got data back because I have a long list of things. The bad news is I'm not accessing the right property on here. So what I'm actually going to do is we could use our React DevTools, or I'm just going to, instead of like console logging the Pokemon response, let's console log our React component state and see what it looks like. And I can kind of see what I missed. And here I think I'm running into the issue, in fact, of React doesn't update state synchronously or necessarily immediately. So when I'm console logging, the React Pokemon state isn't guaranteed to have been updated yet. But if I move this outside of the useEffect and put it here, it should be, because React should be guaranteeing that this useEffect finishes before we move on to whatever's next in our code. And if I look here, that does seem to be what I'm seeing. And I would have thought I had this right, but it looks like I maybe have something wrong. And I saw a hand up.
I was just curious with in line 12 where it says set Pokemon response data dot Pokemon. What do you need the dot Pokemon for? I would have thought it would just be response dot data.
You may be right. Let's actually.
I believe when you do an API pull for the type of Pokemon, it returns an object that has like abilities of the type, Pokemon of the type, and a bunch of stuff. So I think that's actually just calling specifically the Pokemon array and not the other part of the object.
Let's see what we get back when a console log responds to that data. I may have jumped the gun here. Yeah, we're getting back all this information about a specific type of Pokemon, blah, blah, move damage class. There's a list of array of names. It's kind of interesting in different languages. And then, so that it does send back the data object that has all these things. And then in there is a list of Pokemon. And there's something that I'm not accessing correctly here. So I think this part is fine. I think there's something very simple that I'm not getting right here. And actually I am going to jump to,
I think you need to access the index because I think the Pokemon returns an array of objects.
yes, but I should be. I think
So
I
you
should
couldn't
be.
access directly the name there, right? You'd have to access the I element.
I should be iterating through each element in that array. I think the easiest thing, to be honest,
is it pageified? Like, isn't that coming out with like a different pages of?
Yeah,
because you're accessing a lot, so it's like an extra layer. You got to go down. You got to drill down one more.
yeah, I think that may be what it is, that we're getting like an extra page of stuff here. I think you're right, and I was getting a little confused looking at like these console logs because I see. Let's actually we can do this real quick. I've just copied and pasted the whole object into a new thing so we can just see. Okay, so that is a good question. I was wondering about that too here. That's actually just the DevTools console kind of trying to make it easier. It's one big array. It just has an extra layer of nesting that I didn't realize was happening. The object has a property named Pokemon, and then that has a property named name, which is, to be honest, a little annoying. And what I would actually do is I would probably like filter this data or map this data right here to something a little easier. But for now, we can just do Pokemon.name. And I do recommend, by the way, like I should have done this right off the bat. You can right click, say, on something that's printed out in the console, and if it's JSON, just doing like copy object, and sometimes just throwing the JSON in a file to look at is the best way to debug. So now we're cooking, and now we've got a Pokemon app, right? And now we're using the useEffect, and we've got our Pokemon names and stuff. And it only fires once, right? And we're mapping through here. If we wanted to show more stuff, we could like maybe add another component. I think what might be interesting to see is just very quickly, we could put together a dropdown maybe. And like, if we pick a Pokemon from the dropdown, then we make another API call. Would that, are folks interested in that? And actually, let me check in to see what questions people have maybe around the behavior of useEffect. Because we've covered really the bulk of it here. Okay. Let's make a drop down. And we're going to do something very similar here, except instead of a list element, it's option values for the dropdown. And we probably need the key, and we also need the value, which is also going to be Pokemon.name. And there's very clearly a more efficient way to do this than we probably would want the two loops. But again, this is why, like, say, if right up here, I just decide to filter my data, like maybe I want to do const clean Pokemon equals response. I could do something like this. But there is other type data there, so I don't want to mess with that too much. But just to kind of explore that. So now we have a dropdown, right? But what I want to have happen is when I change the dropdown, I want to update some React state. So let's make another bit of state. It'll just be empty list or an empty string. And let's write a little handler function. And what this is going to do is we're just going to set selected Pokemon to event dot, I believe it is event.target dot value. And I could put that in here as well. It starts to get a little verbose, so I put it on a separate line. And we can use, I believe it is the on change attribute. And let's test that this works. Let's maybe do something like this, where let's say H2, we just say select Pokemon. And over here, let's just say another H2 that's all Pokemon. And Pokemon details. And let's just do maybe an H3 that is selected Pokemon. Right? We're applying some of this stuff with state that we learned before. I change this and this works. So now, if we pop over to the Poke API, here's the endpoint to get details for a particular Pokemon. And we're going to go ahead and use that in just a moment. And in fact, I'm just gonna copy all this code and put this in our other useEffect. And I'm gonna say whenever selected Pokemon changes, that's when I want this useEffect to fire. And we'll just call this get Poke details. And we have to change the API a bit, right? It's API/v2. And this needs to become a template literal. And we're going to put our selected Pokemon name in there. And it should look something like that. And I think what I will do is I will just say if selected Pokemon length is greater than 0, because I don't want this to fire like for the default value when there is no Pokemon selected, then we get our selected Pokemon. And that should give us some nice code where we get a whole bunch of Pokemon details. And just as like a rough test, let's just make a div and let's just do something like JSON stringify. Well, the last step here is I don't want to change this, right? I need one more bit of state. And let's call this Pokemon details. Set Pokemon details. And I'll set this one to null by default, because null is falsy. And then over here, I'll use a little ternary to say, hey, if Pokemon details is not falsy, which is a little bit of a hack, but it will work, then let's stringify it. Otherwise, return, let's just say, no Poke details. And let's hop over to our app. So first of all, I need to spell details, right? Second of all, this is a good sign that nothing has broken. I saw a lot of error messages along the way, but if I refresh, I'm not seeing anything. So really now the moment of truth is, well, something didn't succeed here. It looks like I had a bad request. If I had to guess, maybe I just have this URL wrong. Let's go to our network tab, maybe, and look at the HTML requests. And let's request another Pokemon. And let's see what happened here with Magmar and the request. So we're getting back HTTPS PokeAPI/v2/Magmar not found. And indeed, I forgot the Pokemon in front of the name. I'm pretty sure that's the issue. So let's try adjusting and see if that works. Which would make sense because sort of the URL scheme for an API like this is the category of thing we want and then the specific ID. So the Pokemon and then the name of the specific Pokemon that we want. And it worked, but I think the problem here is just it doesn't like JSON stringifying all this stuff. And we should probably just do something else like Pokemon details dot, what does this send back? It sends back so much stuff in here. Does anyone remember like just something simple that we can look at, like their name, maybe? There we go. Pokemon details dot name, just as a proof, right? Let's just prove if this is working or not. So I almost got this working. I I think the error is in. I think the error is probably hiding in here, to be honest. And this does raise a good point, which is sometimes we need another Boolean because this holds our data. So maybe I need a bit of state that says, like, let's call it, is Pokemon details success, so that I know that I've got this. And we're going to set this to false. And then what I'm going to do over here is, oh, well, actually, the real issue here is I never updated Pokemon details. But this is also a good practice because, especially for HTTP requests, sometimes you just might want a Boolean knowing if it succeeded or not. So let's see how far that gets us, because now I can use that Boolean right there. And now if we do this, and then I think the last piece that I need to change here is the shape of the response is different because we're not getting Pokemon type back. So it's not response.data.pokemon. It's the Pokemon name. So now if I wanted to, I could make a whole nother component to show all of my Pokemon details. And thanks for bearing with me here. But the thing to notice with the useEffects is, first of all, we're guaranteed they always happen in this order. So I'm always guaranteed the list is created before I choose something from it. And because I'm watching this bit of component state in my dependency list for this other useEffect, whenever I change it, we fire this useEffect, which makes the HTTP request. And then because when we get stuff back, we update component state, that causes a re-render, and that's how our UI updates. And that's kind of like the magic of the React flow. It's all these little bits, and like one thing cascades into another. So that's really kind of what I wanted to go over a bit. So thank you all so much. I just want to check in to see what questions folks have. How are we feeling about useEffect? Good, so. I'm gonna need some practice. So we're in the middle. Michael, yes, sir.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
I'm definitely going to need practice.
Yeah, no worries. I will send this up. The assignments for today focus a bit more on components and prop. I think the thing to note is, like, when you're making state, it's a lot of little things. And this is really the heart of it. Adding the second useEffect adds in more complexity. But the main thing to remember is, in React, if we want to make an API request, we need to use useEffect. So React knows that we're like stepping outside the system, and we can control like when we get data back and update state with it. And to kind of go to this TL draw diagram, you know, that I was doodling with, the useEffect can also do this, because inside the useEffect, we might change, and this is kind of terrible shorthand, so I apologize. If we change a component state inside this useEffect, that causes a re-render, right? So it's like just this whole sort of chain reaction. It's like one of those Rube Goldberg machines where like the ball goes down the thing, and then it hits the Tweety bird, and then that causes the water to boil, which, you know, causes the balloon to rise, and then the needle pops the balloon. And so it's just like this one little thing causes another. Again, big picture, if you change a component state, it re-renders. If you change the props you pass to a component, it re-renders. And we can use useEffect to control making API requests and updating component state. Let me go ahead and stop the recording.